In this video, we will be talking about the context of the Pauline Epistles. This is part 2 in a series. In the first video, we talked about Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. In this video, we will be talking about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians along with Philemon. 1st Thessalonians is a text that most scholars believe was actually written by Paul the Apostle. More than likely, he wrote it from Corinth while he was founding the Corinthian church there. It was probably written between 49 and 51 CE, though some scholars date it back as early as 41 CE. What we do know is that, by most accounts, this is the earliest letter written by Paul. Like most of the letters we've seen in the New Testament, the letter is named for whom it is addressed to, in this case to the church in Thessalonica, or the Thessalonians. Like with Philippians, we saw Paul being very close to the group he is writing to. The same is true for 1st Thessalonians. Paul seems quite close with this church. There are a couple of intentions that Paul seems to have when writing this text. The first is to reassure and encourage the Christians in Thessalonica in the face of persecution that they may be facing. Again, this is a Roman province. Thessalonica is situated in Macedonia and is the capital of Macedonia, which is a Roman province, and an important urban center of the Roman Empire. So a lot of these Christians were facing persecution by the Roman Empire at this time. Paul also wants to praise the Thessalonians' acceptance of and adherence to the gospel, and also encourage them to be ready for Salvation Day. This last theme seems to be picked up in 2nd Thessalonians, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Paul seems to talk about, throughout 1st Thessalonians, the idea that Jesus is going to come back, not in the future, but in the quite near future, perhaps even within the lifetimes of the Christians who are alive at this point. 2nd Thessalonians may seem to be the second part in a series of letters to the Thessalonians, but many scholars do not believe Paul actually wrote this letter. Some of the reasons that people claim this are because it seems to be copying 1st Thessalonians, which may be true if it is the same author, but there are many points where it's almost too similar that it seems to be an imitation. The letter is also impersonal. As we talked about with 1st Thessalonians, Paul seems to be very close to the church he is writing to, and the same is not true of 2nd Thessalonians. 2nd Thessalonians also, multiple times throughout the text, stresses its authenticity and claims this is a letter of Paul. This is an authentic letter. Much like we might see with people talking today, when somebody stresses something too much, it comes across as being inauthentic rather than actually authentic. And this might be true of 2nd Thessalonians. When we're dating this text, we have two possibilities. If Paul actually wrote the text, it was probably written sometime right after 1st Thessalonians was written. If Paul did not write the text, then it was probably written as early as the late 1st century, so probably 90 to 100 CE, up into the early 2nd century. One of the primary themes that we see in 2nd Thessalonians is a focus on eschatology. Eschatology is the study of the end times, or the last things, and the concern we see here is a bit different from what we see in 1st Thessalonians. The author of 2nd Thessalonians is very focused on what is going to happen at the end times, or when Jesus returns. The intent of the author here is first to explain that the day of the Lord has not yet come. This seems to be the primary reason for writing this letter, and possibly the letter was written to correct some of the things written in 1st Thessalonians that would have been written by Paul. The day of the Lord is an idea we see in the Hebrew Bible as a future day of judgment for Israel's enemies, but of rejoicing for Israel as they will be redeemed by God. This theme is picked up as a future eschatological event, and many people in the Thessalonican church seem to be claiming that God has already come and this day has already passed. However, the author of 2 Thessalonians is arguing this is not the case, and so because of this, they need to resist idleness and be ready for Christ to come again. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are much like the rest of the New Testament letters that we see. They are all addressed to churches and deal with issues in the churches, whether it is being persecuted by the Roman Empire, being oppressed by Jews or Gentiles, or dealing with issues within the church or false teachings, as Paul calls them, and being given instruction on how to move forward from that point. Philemon is quite a bit different from this. Philemon is more than likely an authentic letter of Paul, but rather than being a letter to a church or a group of people, it seems to be a business letter. Paul seems to write this letter from prison, as the letter claims, though we're not entirely sure which imprisonment this is from. Many scholars claim this was from the time that Paul was imprisoned in Rome, which would be around 59 to 62 CE. The letter does not give us much context on what was going on besides this event, so we are not sure at what point during Paul's life this happened, besides that it was during his imprisonment. Paul writes the letter to 3 people, Philemon, Apphia, and Archippus. Now, Philemon is a slave owner, and Paul is writing him to talk about a couple different things. He's first encouraging Philemon to be kind to Onesimus, who's the slave who seems to have run away. Now, Onesimus was one of Philemon's slaves who either ran away or went without his master's knowledge, possibly to Rome, and when he met Paul, became a Christian. Now, Paul talks quite highly of Onesimus in the letter to Philemon. So Paul is encouraging, when he sends Onesimus back to Philemon, that Philemon is kind to Onesimus. He also seems to indicate that he wants Philemon to send Onesimus back to Paul, because he has found Onesimus so helpful. Paul has taught Onesimus at this point and enjoys his company simply, and wishes to have that back. And Paul also seems to possibly indicate that he wants Onesimus freed from slavery. In verse 21 of Philemon, it says, "Confident of your obedience, I am writing to you, knowing that you will do even more than I say." So Paul, again, is writing to Philemon and saying, please do these things for Onesimus and for me. And saying, please do these, but I understand that you probably will do more than I say, which in this case is probably freeing Onesimus from slavery. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the authorship, composition date, audience, and authorial intent of 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Describe the historical setting and context of the letters, and identify the themes in the letters and give examples of how they are used in the texts.